Hey everyone. Today I'm joined by Tim Vermeulen, professor of media, culture, and society at the University of Oslo. Now, along with colleague Robin Vandenacker, he was the first to popularize the term metamodernism with a seminal 2010 article in the Journal of Aesthetics and Culture titled Notes on Metamodernism. Their webzine of the same name, which ran from 2009 to 2016, published numerous articles from various contributors analyzing art and culture through the lens of this new postmodern paradigm. 2017 saw the publication of their book, along with co-author Alison Gibbons, Metamodernism, Historicity, Affect, and Depth After Postmodernism, an anthology of essays exploring metamodernism across the arts. Vermeulen continues to write on culture, including as a regular contributor to Frieze magazine. And I'm so happy to have you for some discussion today. I've been wanting to talk about metamodernism for years. I first met you, 7 years ago, back in 2014, went to the Oscillate Metamodernism in the Humanities conference at Strathclyde and spoke about metamodern religion in that context. Flew over to the Amsterdam conference, Metamodernism, Return of History, at the Stedelijk. And yeah, a lot's kind of happened since then. That was 2014. So, and at this point, with metamodernism as a topic, as a paradigm, as an idea, over a decade old, I thought it would be really cool to talk about just the whole development of the idea, where it stands now, how you came to it, and to talk maybe a little bit about some of the more recent permutations and the directions that it's going. So thank you so much. And yeah, I don't know if you have any. Of course. So yeah, would you maybe, well, you can begin anywhere you like, but if you wanted to start with exploring or discussing a little bit, where metamodernism as a term came from, the ideas behind it, how you developed it, and what led to its origins.
I think that in the 2000s, from the early 2000s onwards, I was studying history and then philosophy and then a variety of media studies across Holland and the UK, and also visited a number of art galleries and museums, and I started noticing, alongside many others, I think it's fair to say, and I'm sure you're one of them, a set of changes that were quite subtle, sometimes quite radical at other times, that seemed to suggest that all the stuff that I was being taught at that very moment at university, especially stuff around those notions of the end of history or post-structuralism or postmodernism, that those changes seem to suggest that the stuff that I was taught at university was no longer really applicable to the reality around me, right? And so the theories that I would have thought to use to understand cultural phenomena seem to be out of date somehow. And so there was this sense, okay, we need a new kind of vocabulary to make sense of the things that we're seeing. And in the simplest way, what Robin and Niels van Pucke and I, back in London in 2008, I think we started talking about this. I think we called it metamodernism, or we first actually called it judo-modernism, and then we called it, I think, something modernism, and then metamodernism. Was an attempt to name and to find a cohesive framework for some of these developments. And when I say cohesive, of course, it doesn't cover everything. Perhaps it covers very little, right? There's always different kinds of movements and sensibilities emerging. But it was our attempt to come to terms simply with some of the stuff we were seeing. We were seeing in literature, right? Zadie Smith, Foster Wallace, Jennifer Egan. We were seeing it in the arts, the return of all those manifestos that you saw in art spaces, the return of a sense of optimism, of utopianism even. We saw in literature the return of the epic novel. We saw in music, which was Niels's field, loads of queer folk and a focus on communities and on simple instruments. I remember Coco Rosie being a big thing back then. And generally speaking, a return of a kind of romantic, with a big R, romantic sensibility. And so this was an attempt to just give a name and a particular kind of discourse to some of the stuff we were sensing, I guess. Right? That's the simplest explanation. Yeah.
So between that article, even in 2010, and the book, which came out in 2017, were there various sort of changes, developments? The book struck me as being a lot more about the return of history, though maybe that was always there very strongly at the beginning. But the article seemed to have much more about the neo-romantic turn and sort of framing it in those ways. And were there ways that you sort of were adjusting the framework even say between 2010, 2015, 2016, or did it seem to maintain a certain kind of basic continuity?
I mean, I would say, but I mean, you've been reading it along, so I'm guessing you might have something to say about this as well. But I would say both. I think the observations that we made in 2008 and then slowly, it takes a while for an academic article to get published. So I think we wrote it in 2008 and then it finally got published in 2010 after peer review and everything. But I think those observations we felt in 2017, and I think I still feel today, mostly still stand. There are changes across the arts, and those changes seem to signify, they seem to signal and indicate and perhaps celebrate and also warn us of political changes that are running parallel to them, right? And so I think those observations, which pertain to a new sense of urgency, a new sense of hope, a new sense of sincerity, perhaps also a new sense of desperation, and the particular ways in which those sensibilities were affected, right? Which is both a movement of going somewhere else, whilst at the same time having that doubt perhaps that we were all trained to have from a young age, and I think which is very important, that was sort of constantly held in check or held back by that doubt. I think that tension, I think I still see in so many of the phenomena around me, both in terms of the arts and the political culture that and politics here with a big P, so the more geopolitical, political, economical sense, they still stand, right? So I'm quite happy still in many ways with some of those observations. I think that they can still be used and applied to contemporary modes. What changed is that we had a number of conferences. For example, we had the Oscillate conferences, we had the Stedelijk Museum conference, other people started writing articles. And so what changed is discourse. You get new insights, so you add to it, you rethink. For example, I think it's obvious that article 228 was written on the back of Obama's election. And so there was, and also on the back of the financial crisis. And I think Robin and I both had this sense that perhaps something was to change for the better, right? We figured that maybe Obama could make a change. We figured that the financial crisis in 2008 would actually also enact some kind of meaningful changes as to the way in which capitalism interferes or dominates or colonizes our life, that there would be perhaps a more humane capitalism, or, I mean, Robinism is Marxist, or that we can get rid of capitalism, right? Which is not my idea necessarily. But in any case, we felt that some meaningful changes might take place. And so the article was written as a series of observations that we tried to make sense of, right? All these different things that were happening that we just put on a big pile and said, there are some common denominators here, and they have to do with, we probably will return to this, with structure of feeling, with sensibility. And we felt that something might change. And I think in 2017, it became obvious that not only did those changes not materialize, that a whole different set of changes materialized that I think we can all safely agree were tremendously disastrous. So in that sense, there's definitely a sea change, right? 2008 is written after Obama is elected. The book comes out after Donald Trump is elected. So that is a massive difference.
Sure. Well, so yeah, picking up the idea of the structure of feeling, when the first article appeared, it was sort of this, oh, we're getting an intimation, we're getting a sense that this thing's kind of here. It's not really fully formed. It's kind of inchoate, but it's on the horizon. It's coming. And now, that we're kind of 10 years out from that, do you feel like that structure of feeling, and I'd love it if you kind of got into what that, is and how you describe it, but do you feel like it did arrive in the way that you kind of imagined, or is it, because one of the questions I'd have is sort of like, one of the ways of framing metamodernism, especially as opposed to postmodernism, is talking about the dominant structure of feeling in the society. And I guess my question would be, is metamodernism the dominant structure of feeling, or is it still, maybe even as it was then, sort of coming into greater greater dominance, or at least just greater reality, greater presentation, visibility in the world?
Yeah, I mean, I will come to structure of feeling. There's two answers to this question. The first is, yes, I do think metamodernism, which was emerging, I would imagine, or becoming dominant in 2008, is the dominant structure of feeling, but it depends on where we're looking, right? So it depends on where you're asking for. I'm writing, and this is very important, and we wrote this from the get-go, but especially we emphasized this in 2017 in the book. Both Robin and I, we grew up in Holland, right, which is a very specific context with a very specific history. We are white, we are male, right? I mean, maybe we're not much of men, but we are men somehow. And so it's very important, I think, to acknowledge this perspective. We are talking about a very distinct sensibility in a very distinct place. I don't know how this sensibility fares in cultural context that I know very little about. For example, I don't know how it would work in the Arab world. I don't know how it works in China. My guess is that there is some overlap, because some of our articles were translated into Farsi, for example, and into to Arab and into Mandarin. So I'm guessing that there is some sense of overlap, but I have no clue how that really translates. So I do think it's dominant. It's dominant definitely here in Europe, and I'm guessing from what I know from American culture, it is dominant in America, but I don't know if it's dominant everywhere. As to this notion of the structure of feeling, and this is quite important. So this is a notion that we took from Raymond Williams. And we took it from Raymond Williams first because we love Raymond Williams. We thought he was an incredible literary and cultural theorist and thinker, but also because Frederick Jameson co-opts this notion from Raymond Williams to discuss postmodernism. And so, of course, the notion of the structure of feeling is Ben Cranfield at one point put it like this, is a feeling that structures, right? So we liked the notion because it's for Williams, it's this moment in culture that we all feel, right? That we all sense something. It's structural, right? It's everywhere, and yet we can't really pin it down. It has the fleetingness, the intangibility of a feeling. And so it's not yet hegemony, it's not yet ideology, it's this fleeting, this sense that nonetheless we are all experiencing. And by all, I'm again thinking here of all in particular reasons or in particular moments in time, or perhaps even in particular generations, right? But so this feeling, and Ben Cranfield then says it's a feeling that structures, which I like. And there's this Noel Carroll, I'm guessing you know of, is an American philosopher, and he has this article where he distinguishes emotion from mood. And I think the notion of Raymond Williams' structure of feeling comes close to this notion of mood, where Carroll says an emotion is short-lived, it's punctured, right? It's something that comes about from an externality. So for example, if you now throw garbage out and into nature, and then I get angry, right? I say, you're ruining our planet. And so that's an emotion. It's something that responds to an externality that I feel is impinging on my sense of self and the world. But then when you say, I'm really sorry, right? Maybe. And then I say, okay, we can be friends again. But if I get up in a foul mood, perhaps because I went to bed really late last night, which I did, my kids were up all night and up very early, or because I ate, I don't know, McDonald's or some terrible junk food, right? And I feel really off today, then regardless of how nice you are to me, this mood pervades, right? Noel Carroll writes, it's a kind of a filter, and it draws sort of everything in its orbit and sort of meshes up. And so the structure of feeling in Williams' sense is similar to this mood. And there's one important thing that Williams writes, and he writes this in 54 when he begins writing about Michael Oram, which is that he came to this notion because he said, look, if you have an artwork, say, or a book, or any product of its time, if you analyze it, he writes this in the times of structuralism, of course, and you take everything apart, you've got the whole structure laid out. There's this residue, this leftover that all the products of this time seem to share. this leftover residue. That's the structure of feeling. It's the stuff that no one has put in, but is there, right? And I think I wrote somewhere, or I don't know if we did in this book or somewhere else, like with whiskey, right? Whiskey that's made at the Isles is saltier than whiskey that's made in the Highlands, just because the air is saltier. And so that filters in. And so that is the structure of feeling. Susan Sontag, of course, also uses it in Notes on Kant. But as said, we come to it also because Jameson uses it. And postmodernism means many, many things, right? In many very different contexts. And it can be a critical tool, it can be a theory, it can be a structure of feeling, it can be an emancipatory tale, it can be about minor errors, and so on and so forth. But for Jameson, for better or worse, it is mostly the structure of feeling. It's a particular cultural dominant. And he describes this cultural dominant as the senses of an end. He says after the fall of the Berlin Wall and the collapse of the Soviet Empire, there's all these senses of an end that go about. And I lived through these in Holland, so I felt them intimately. The sense that there is, as Margaret Thatcher says, no alternative, or that there is, as Spunk said, no future. This idea that this is it, could be great, could be terrible, but we're kind of stuck here. Francis Fukuyama very prematurely calls this the end of history. And so that's a structure of feeling. And Jameson says all these art forms are completely different, right? They have nothing to do with each other in terms of aesthetic register or devices used or politics. But that's not the point. The point is, he says, that they all share this residue, this leftover thing, this salt. And so this was our starting point in many ways, because this was the postmodernism that we felt was no longer adequate for us to understand the world around us. The idea was that this salt, right, that we had moved, you could say, from the Isles to the Highlands in some way. There was a different residue. And so metamodernism is the attempt, and the name then for, I guess, this residue, this stuff that is in all of those cultural products and all those political movements, regardless of what they have in mind, regardless of whether it's the Tea Party, which was gaining traction when we were writing this, or Occupy or the Indignados, right? They are sharing some of that salt, even though their aims are obviously entirely different. The extent to which, if we think of the local, right, this sort of nationalist focus on the local is present, but also within food cultures, and I would say the left and the progressive, there is a focus on locality. Completely different, and yet at the same time they share some kind of sentiment. So it's this structure of feeling, this mood, this sensibility that we were after. Have I made clear what it is?
Sure. Yeah. And so then say a little bit about what does, as you say, history comes roaring back. So what comes back, roaring back with metamodernism, with that return of history?
I mean, to be clear, history never ended, right? I think we probably both agree, right? It never ended, as we know.
The sense of the end,
yeah, exactly, right. Yeah. These senses of an end that were all around. I think it's a variety of things. It's definitely a series, I would imagine, of events. Some people say 9/11, which Roman and I have always doubted because it seemed to be creating a move inwards, but definitely the financial crisis was a contributing factor. Definitely, and very importantly, I think we can agree that the ecological crisis is a factor here, where we are understanding that the ways in which we have, both financially and ecologically, the ways in which we've been living our lives and treating both others and the world around us is unsustainable. And I do need to give a caveat here, which is very important. I just read this wonderful quote by someone, I don't know who wrote that dystopian fiction is nothing more than when what happens to marginalized people is suddenly happening to the West in a way. And I do think this is what we're talking about here, right? People who worked in factories from when they were a child in, I don't know, Bangladesh or China or closer to home, I don't know, Poland, they always knew that capitalism was tremendously unfair. People who saw their livelihoods in their homes being washed over by floods, who had sinkholes every now and then, who loads of tornadoes and whatever, they always knew that the way in which we treated the world was unsustainable. But of course, it's the moment that those people who still seem to be deciding where money goes, etc., when it hits them, when this dystopian reality also becomes theirs, that's the moment where they say, oh, wow, maybe we should change some shit, right? So I think it's an important caveat. Mm-hmm. It's not something new, but it's the traveling of particular realities to the capital center, you could say. So that's one. I think second, of course, social media, Web 2.0 changes everything, right? That the moment that there's no longer a gatekeeper, the moment that every single person has the possibility to share their opinion and to be heard, the moment that you can sign a petition within minutes on Twitter for the most ridiculous, but also perhaps the most important things, that changes everything, right? So I do think we often, I don't want to turn this into some kind of teleological narrative where technology changes everything, but it does. In the same way that the moment that the car comes into play and that distances between cities and distances between countries are suddenly made so tiny, and you see this collapse of the world almost into one another, or the moment that telephone lines and so on and so forth, this technological shift obviously comes into play as well, because it allows for a new way of interaction and it allows for different voices to be heard. And then finally, a generational desire, I think is very important. I don't necessarily know or think, it's not this, I don't want to create either this Marxist picture of where the material world steers all cultural shifts, or this techno biased image where technology makes everything happen. I do think there is also a sentiment amongst the new generation of people where they're just fed up with the old. This was, I don't know how you felt that, but when we were at the Stedelijk and we heard Fukuyama talk, and I thought it was very brave of Fukuyama to come to that event, because he knew that everyone else there was not a fan, right? That everyone else there was basically both left-wing and did not really.
I remember him watching the video of him like falling through space and just sort of being like, this is quite a scene to witness.
Yeah, constantly falling on that needle. I thought this was really something. Yeah. This La Chute de Fukuyama by Camille de Toledo, who wrote a wonderful book, by the way, Coming of Age at the End of History. But I thought that was quite interesting that he seemed to just say, look, nothing really changed. People are just bored, right? Which I'm guessing you and I would agree is probably a gross misreading of why people started rebelling or started forming new alliances. And yet it's also probably not entirely untrue, because I don't think Foster Wallace was thinking of any of the ecological or financial injustices. I think he was just thinking, this is unsustainable for me. I'm bored with this shit. And so I do think it's those three factors. There's a series of geopolitical, financial, ecological shifts, a feeling that the world is unsustainable. I think there is this ability, this affordance that social media and the various new ways of being in touch with people and being heard. And I think it's a generational desire. So I do think those sort of three facets come together. And maybe I realize I'm talking for a really long time. Really sorry, Brendan. I hope this is okay, but stop me at any moment.
No, the point is for you to talk. So
okay, no, good. I mean, I feel I don't know. There's this work that you know well by Annabelle Daou, and I love this work, the Lebanese American artist. Which side are you on? For me, this work, in a way, is a microcosm, I guess, of what we're talking about. It's this work, Which Side Are You On?, which is an old 1950s television with a Mashriba screen on it, still image, and on this television you hear the artist asking people, which side are you on? And people are really scrambling to answer. So some people make jokes, sunny side up or whatever. Some people are very serious, but everyone has that moment of hesitation. Which side am I on? And for me, this is in a way the key, and this is key in two parts. The reason that this question is so difficult to answer is first that you don't have any parameters. So it could be about anything. This could be which side are you on when it comes to football, or which side are you on when it comes to humanity or human rights or the environment. And so the moment that you say, I'm supporting, I don't know, Arsenal or the Cleveland Cavaliers, and then the next person says, I'm supporting the side of the environment. You feel like a prick, right? Because then you've said this stupid thing. And so parameters are open. So that's very difficult. There's no guidance. There's no sort of frame within which you are asked to make those decisions. And the second is, of course, the famous Lyotarian parable of Different, where he says you have this archipelago, which is how we were all in a way trained at school, right? Especially if you grew up in Holland, and I'm guessing in America as well, where Lyotard said, all those terrible, ghastly things that those utopian narratives, that ideological meta-narratives created for us, where you have one truth and you all believe in it and you're willing to fight for the truth regardless of the cost, right? Robespierre, Saint-Just and the Enlightenment and French Revolution, the pogroms and Soviet Union, the Nazis, obviously, with the Holocaust, all of that was terrible. So he says we shouldn't do that. We should see of ourselves as an admiral on a ship sailing between the islands in an archipelago. And we understand, it's sort of Wittgensteinian game, that every island has its own rules. And we shouldn't go on land. No, we should understand that different places have different truths. We should understand that perhaps more things than one could be good, right? Or could be bad. That there are just different sides that all have their own values. And so the question that Annabel Daoust asks, and that is for me that central question of that residue, of that metamodern sensibility, is what do you do if you perceive, it could be also happening, but I don't know. In any case, what do you do if you perceive the ship to be sinking? You have to choose a side. How do you cope with that? How do you deal with that? How do you try and make sense and give direction and meaning to your life at that very moment? You know that not one side is necessarily better, and yet you have to somehow pertain to this new reality. And I'm guessing in a way with those three things, those crises and those injustices and the social media affordances and the generational desire, it pertains to this sentiment. What do you do when you feel that the ship is sinking?
Yeah. And I mean,
I would say that's the metamodern sensibility for me in a way.
Yeah. And with all these events that you're talking about, especially the ecological crisis, and with the sense of urgency, with the sense of needing to make a decision, it seems like there's been a return to various kinds of grand narrative thinking, because it's sort of like, well, we have to do something. And if the ship is sinking, we have to be on some side, and we can't just sort of sit back in the kind of comfort of our kind of postmodern luxury and just sort of, okay, well, whatever, and be apathetic about it. We have to make a commitment to something. And so it seems to force a kind of, idealism of some kind, which you even spoke about in the first article about this pragmatic idealism. Do you feel like that's a fair notion, that there's a sort of return to grand narrative thinking or utopian thinking of some kind? It's sort of like, well, choose an island, and then in some ways that'll be something that you're striving for, because we can't stay where we are.
Yeah, yes. Well, again, yes and no. I keep saying yes and no, but I do think yes and no. I mean, first, I think it's important to add something to your description of postmodernism here as apathetic, which of course is not necessarily the case, right? The sense of an ending doesn't necessarily mean indifference. There's also an incredibly critical approach, right? In this notion of the archipelago, there's a very critical approach, and also quite useful, which is that you can suddenly allow for completely diverging discourses to coexist, which is a beautiful belief, I think, right? That the incommensurable can coexist in this model of the archipelago. So it's not just apathetic. I think it's a particular notion of the world that indeed allows you not to take a side, right? And I think today it's even if someone accuses you of not taking a side, I think it's also they're berating you, they're criticizing you, right? You're staying out of it. And it will often be associated, I think rightly, with having privilege, with not having to take a side. But so in any case, so that's the first, just minor perhaps amendment to what you said. Yes, I do think, here comes the yes, that we are then thinking about a particular kind of utopianism or pragmatic utopianism and a return of a grand narrative in some sort. But, and this is very, very important, it isn't the grand narrative yet, I should probably add, that we saw in the in modernity, right? That we saw in those large meta narratives that would steer and frame all of our meaning making and give direction to our lives entirely. It seems to be a grand narrative in spite of, you might say, or it seems to be we have to, but oh dear, is this going to be something? And I do think that what we see now a lot is this knee-jerk reaction, which is the metamodern. This is the metoxis. This is the movement between opposite poles, where you are both those ends, and because you cannot be both of those ends at the same time, neither of them. You're both on two islands at the same time, and on neither of them is a sort of a desperate movement between, right? And I do think this is the dark side, you might say, of this, which is Donald Trump, where Donald Trump will say, this is true today, and he will say the opposite is true tomorrow, and it's irrelevant. It's irrelevant also to his electorate. They don't really care because they say, yeah, less taxes. Yeah, they say the next day, better schools, right? Even though probably it would be the taxes that would pay for those better schools. And so it is also this sort of absolutist relativism that I think we see a lot with demagogues and populists right now. So it's, yes, there is this forward move. Yes, there is a return to those narratives that can explain entirely, but those narratives are quite explicitly inconsistent, incohesive, forever unfinished. They cannot really work. It's not a puzzle that works. And this is quite important because it's going to mean probably tragedy for all of us, because of course tragedy for the Greeks is nothing else than this, right? It's a puzzle that doesn't fit. It's Antigone and Creon, which I always think is the best example. Antigone and Creon both being completely in their right. Antigone wanting family law, Creon wanting state law. Cannot come together, even though they're both right. And I think this is sort of the similar tension that we're seeing here emerge. Is this, on the left, I would say, is sort of an informed naivety, and on the right and the populist side, this weird absolutist relativism, which is terrifying.
Do you, what do you make of the idea that what we're actually seeing, at least in some part on the right, is actually just postmodernism finally getting to kind of conservative populations of and political thought in a way that it had already sort of, as a wave, kind of passed over the left? I mean, in some ways, I don't think it's unfair to say that postmodernism as a paradigm was mostly articulated by people on the left, especially Marxists or Marxian thinkers, and definitely had sort of a, I mean, of course, it becomes sort of the boogeyman of people on the right about just sort of this, the postmodern cultural Marxists and things like that. But there is still also a kind of truth that it seems to me, especially as it was expressed in the academy, as sort of used in emancipatory leftist ways by using kind of this tool of, well, let's critique absolute truth, let's show how it's culturally bounded and relative, et cetera. Do you think that some of those ideas have just finally sort of percolated to the right, so that now Donald Trump or someone like him can kind of just use this post-truth tool that was originally developed maybe for emancipatory ends and now is being used for oppressive ends? Does that paradigm seem valid in any way, or do you see the Donald Trump phenomena very much as a metamodern thing?
For me, Donald Trump is entirely metamodern in the way that he uses some of the really, I think, of the advances that postmodernism and post-structuralism have given us, which is that truth is relative, which I think is a very important understanding. Doesn't mean necessarily that truth is gone, right? That there is no truth, but I think it's an awareness of the context specificity that a lot of things seem to have, right? Again, the islands. Something might be true over there, over your side of the ocean, that isn't true here. It's entirely conceivable. It probably is the case indeed. So truth is dependent on context in many ways. And I think actually what is happening now with populism is that they take this understanding, but they don't take it necessarily to then just indeed say, oh, we have to be cautious with saying things. No, they use that relativism precisely to articulate absolute new truths, but just for a day. Right, so that's why this absolutist relativism is so important and so scary, is it takes that in the same way I think that many emancipatory practices today take it. They take the relativism, but they match it in this case with a very, very scary absolute truth. So it is precisely the relativism that allows them to postulate a new, often absolute ridiculous and provably false truth. This sort of particular structure that the relativism precisely allows you to make a claim that is absolute, if only for a moment.
Yeah,
and if that is liberating, I also think that we have seen that this is, quite terrifying.
Sure. So, I mean, there's a lot of areas I'd love to go into all that and explore and get your thought, because I'm really interested in the ways that we see, while we might see a certain dominant postmodern structure, metamodern structure of feeling, there's also a lot of residual postmodernism, and there's a lot of ways that I think that postmodernism sort of only comes to dominance, as you say, in the same way that metamodern sort of comes to dominance in certain areas in a non in a highly differentiated way. Let's say that in some areas it's very pronounced, in others not so much. I think similarly postmodern thinking, and in the same way that, like, I think about how government, like if you think about a court proceeding, or people still wear the wigs, right? Because the cultural trends and fads and styles kind of take so much longer to percolate up into highly institutionalized, formal environments. I see a lot of what you're talking about in some ways is sort of like, especially in the political scene, it took that much longer for postmodernism finally to really immerse our institutions and our political system to the point where we could finally have like a fully postmodern president, say. And yet at the same time, I see a lot of what you're talking about in terms of how these things are working but anyway, that's just my 2 cents.
Well, maybe if I can say one thing to that, because I mean, I understand what you're saying, but I do think it's important that what we see with, for example, Tony Blair, right, in the 1990s, and New Labour, and I think The Thick of It, I'm on the Iannucci show, does such a great job of ridiculing this. I think that's where we see postmodern politics at play. It is where you no longer believe in any grand narrative or story, but like Tony Blair, and this is what's so good about The Thick of It, instead you go to all of the people in your society and you ask them what they think should be happening, right? And they say, well, I think the street should be, I don't know, whatever. They say all kinds of weird stuff. And then you create some kind of policy on the basis of that shit, right? That is the complete lack of an overarching narrative and allowing to people like you and me to have a say. For me, that was a sort of a sense. And I think Veep, which is also by Iannucci, is in a way still, that's a leftover for me of a postmodern sentiment. This idea that politicians are also just people, opportunistic people with no sort of ideological backbone, who are just trying to do some shit, right? And they're always running behind the facts and things like that. I think importantly, what we see, I think now if you'd make a show, it'd be probably something more like House of Cards, where you actually believe that there is some kind of secret shit happening behind the scenes, right? So you no longer, you believe that there is a narrative, you just don't know what it is. There's a kind of epistemic dispossession in a way. You have the feeling the truth is somewhere there is some kind of truth, but it's just, you don't have access to it. And so for me, that would be a kind of distinction.
Well, I wanted to pick up on some of these threads too, because in terms of the topic of sort of the development of metamodernism over the years, so I noticed something kind of shift in the way that the discourse was being engaged and deployed around 3 years ago. And actually in 2017, another book was published as well on metamodernism, or at least with metamodern in the title. There's the Hanzi books that came on the scene with the Metamodern Guide to Politics. And there's been sort of a shift in the way that the conversation has gone, using the frame of metamodernism with explicit reference to your work, and picking it up, and in some ways sort of applying it in these kinds of utopian, pragmatic, idealistic projects, political metamodernism, as they call it. But more than just the Hanzi books, I mean, there's been, whether it's Lene Rachel Andersen with Metamodernity and Tomas Björkman, Jonathan Rowson, Layman Pascal just published through Perspectiva Press an anthology called Metamodernity. There's a lot of people engaging with the term metamodernism and metamodern that is really seemed like kind of I don't know, almost renaissance or an explosion of interest in the topic. It's gained a lot of interest in these kind of new circles that are bringing in new kinds of kind of threads to the conversation. And I just kind of wanted to get your perspective on that in terms of how you understand your relationship to this kind of new engagement with the term, and whether this excites you or brings some anxiety. I mean, the fact that in many ways the idea of metamodernism really, despite also the fact that others were using the term before you and Robin were using it, there is sort of a lineage back to that, ultimately that 2010 article and everything that's sort of come from it. So I'm just curious about these new developments in metamodernism and what your take is on them.
I mean, it's a good question. I mean, I don't know. As you said, the term is really much older than 2010. I don't know. I mean, I'm keen. I think what worries me maybe, or what is so important for me to state clearly, is that in a way, metamodernism is a kind of a placeholder, right, for Robin and me. It seems like the most useful term because of the meta and the metaxis of Plato to describe what we were seeing around us, to begin creating a kind of a critical vernacular to make sense of those changing cultural phenomena and the political shifts that they signified. So it's a tool in a way. And if another term would be better, maybe there's already one around, that would better describe or better capture those developments, then I would say, let's go to that other term. For me, metamodernism seems to be the best of the worst. Like, it's at the moment, it seems to me the most useful label to put on those developments to begin understanding it. Mm-hmm. But it's irrelevant in a way, right? What I'm interested in is people that are somehow trying to make sense, trying to figure out what is happening there, right? What are the distinct tendencies and developments that we see, and how could we begin to make sense of them, and indeed perhaps eventually develop but this is not as an academic my field, right? I'm not equipped, I think, to do that with the skill sets I have that are very limited, but perhaps to eventually create a progressive politics from there. But that's not my field. Mm-hmm. So if people are making progressive politics and they use that term because they also think it's a useful term to create a new politics, then great. If they use another term, then great. That's I think up for anyone to do. But I don't think it's the metamodern itself that can be a progressive politics, because the metamodern, as Robin and I and Alison in any case, and Niels before that, conceived of it, was simply observing what was already around us, right? I didn't bring anything new into the world. I think it's literally giving a name to stuff that most of us had been seeing, had been talking about, had been sort of debating at conferences and on blogs. And so it was something that's around, and you give a name and you try and give a sort of a vocabulary to these developments, but it is in itself something new. So I think if there's a politics that takes some of those observations to create a new progressive politics, that's wonderful. And if they call it metamodern or whatever, that's fine. But I don't think it should be necessarily that the metamodern itself should be seen as something new that can bring about those changes. Do you understand the distinction? Because it is already there, right? It's not something, it's not a new philosophy. Right. That's the important thing. Metamodernism in that way, it wasn't a program, right? It is not like materialism, the philosophical, which I think is a program. And you could actually use that program to create a new kind of Spinozist, vitalist way of living together, because it brings something new into the world. And metamodernism, in our sense, did not bring something new into the world. It just created a vocabulary for what was already there. Again, if someone is creating from that vocabulary a new program, then that's fine.
And that's, I guess, is that dialectical element I'm interested in, because it's sort of like you were describing cultural phenomena that were there in a descriptive way and gave it some terms like sincere irony, for example, is a crucial one, pragmatic idealism, and naming this sort of neo-romantic turn and a utopian striving that's aware of itself, etc. And then by introducing those ideas into the culture, you allowed people to then sort of name that kind of elusive structure of feeling that you were able to speak to. And then they were able to use those terms and sort of apply them, arguably, because I know that one of the things that struck me so much about finding metamodernism when I did was that even just the idea of talking about post irony or being sincere in some way, the idea of talking about what David Foster Wallace was talking about in the old untrendy human truths in a way that wasn't just kitsch or pastiche or sort of, this was it was encouraging, and it was like, oh, this is somehow justified or acceptable in some way. And at least what I feel like I've seen is a lot of people come to a realization by having this sort of framework to frame their sensibility within it. It creates this dialectic where now it's like, okay, well, let's sort of use these, let's put these into practice. And so arguably, I think you could view, say, whether it's the Hanzi books or these other forms of political programs as sort of being very self-consciously aware of, we're going to do some kind of a grand narrative thing here, but we're going to be highly aware of the fact that we're doing it, deeply self-conscious, and we're going to be doing it in a sincerely ironic way, which to me seems like an enactment of some of these ideas once they're sort of put out into the world. So even though, I'm not, they're certainly distinct in what your project has been and how these folks are using it, but there seems to be continuity there. But maybe you would disagree, or maybe you would attenuate that.
I think I know too little of it, because even though many of these texts use the same name, in a way it's a different field, I guess, from what I'm interested in also. And I think, there is one caution, I think, which is important for me, which is that just as Jameson said, that for him, postmodernism was a cultural logic of something else, which is namely late capitalism. I don't think that metamodernism should be seen in isolation from some of those political economic systems, right? I think that it's, I agree. For me, I remember reading Zadie Smith and thinking, this is wow, or Ben Lerner, and thinking this is changing everything, or Roberto Bolaño, and feeling this utopian spirit, right? So I understand that sentiment very well. And again, I think it was evident in that 2010 article. But I don't think we should, they are all related to capitalism. They are not loose from it. That is not to say that they cannot somehow enact changes, right? This is why we originally had judo-modernism in mind, where Foucault talks about judo as something that takes the energy that's already there to redirect it. So there is no new energy. There is no actual metaphysical thing going on. There aren't some secret layers. Everything is there, and yet you redirect it, right? You take over the energy in existence to push it into a different direction. And I think that, so there is the possibility that all of those cultural phenomena and sensibilities might also help us develop new political systems or economic systems. But I just want to add that caution, right? And this is also why I'm so adamant on making clear that if the Occupy Wall Street and the Indignados were, for me, an expression of a metamodern structure of feeling, that the Tea Party and Donald Trump are too, right? That if I say that pragmatic idealism, which allows us to build greener houses, or to reduce our carbon footprint, or to be kinder to people around us, that if that is part of what I imagine is the metamodern structure of feeling, so is this absolutist relativism or relativist absolutism, however you want to call it, and so is shaming culture, right? So I think those things aren't mutually exclusive. They are all part and parcel for me of that same structure of feeling, and it all does tie in. I think that's why someone like Jody Dean is so important. that whole sensibility ties into an extent with neoliberalism, with capitalism, with a particular understanding of self and the world that cannot be seen in isolation from the way in which capitalism works. And so that's, I think, my caution in terms of applying one-to-one sensibility to a political program. But as said, I think I told you this before, I don't know enough about it, and I think I am interested in work that engages critically with, for example, the writing we've done, but also other works that might disagree entirely or take it into a different direction, but that tries to use it to create a vernacular of our world from which we can build something. I'm not sure if it's my field to use it as politics, and also, frankly, I think I'm too much a child of postmodernism to feel comfortable believing myself fully in a new political system.
That's fascinating. I'm intrigued by that, because even like I think about David Foster Wallace articulating so much of the ideas of metamodernism, and yet not really fully ever, enacting them in his own work. No. It's sort of a theoretical thing, but then it's sort of like Moses. I think both Greg Dember and I use this example about him, where he sort of leads people to the quote unquote promised land, but never kind of goes through himself. I also wonder, though, I mean, do you feel like it's pertinent to retain a sort of academic distance from these newer instantiations of metamodernism, or would you consider sort of engaging these communities and these discourses in some direct way?
No, I mean, I think it's wonderful that people are finding, fertile grounds in these writings and in these observations, and manage to use them for directions which I'm sure can be wonderful or can be terrifying. But I mean, that's in a way, I do think there is some academic distance there, right? Where I think it's not what I am supposed to be doing in my job. It's also not what I'm good at, right? I don't think it's my skill set. I don't think it's where I want to go. I don't see that necessarily as how do I say this in the best way? It's not what I'm interested in.
Sure.
I'm interested, yes, in progressive politics, but I think there's people who can probably do that better than I can, which is not a cop-out. It's not to say I don't want to share or want to join in the problem, but I think within this project, that's not where my strength should lie.
Well, and I'm also, to broaden this a little bit, when I'm thinking of some of these metamodern communities, it's not just the political progressive, programs that I'm thinking of either. There are also folks that are sort of using these ideas and bringing them into conversation with, new forms of spirituality, which is actually in some ways is really what I'm particularly interested in. I mean, my familiarity with metamodernism begins with your work. And so now it's sort of like there's this new infusion of ideas from groups like integral, theory folks and stuff like that, who, based in Ken Wilber's work back in the 90s and early 2000s, were already trying to, in some ways, do something postmodern. But those kinds of streams interacting, and then people kind of using these Wilber ideas through an ironically sincere lens, and et cetera, et cetera. But I guess just to make the point that when I'm talking about these new kind of emerging communities around the term metamodernism, not just meaning a political program, because I also think of, say, again, Lene Rachel Andersen's work, who's using these more from the perspective of pedagogy and Bildung, and trying to find, ways of incorporating, indigenous wisdom and traditional wisdom. And I guess that's sort of what strikes me, is that, yeah, there seemed to be this flourish of interest, and maybe it is just the veneer of a term, or maybe there really is a deeper structure of feeling that's uniting these different communities. But I've just been intrigued to kind of see that happening, and yet, I kind of sense a sort of reticence, and maybe it's an academic distance, maybe it's just a lack of interest or familiarity. But the fact that there's this sort of burgeoning energy and inertia, momentum amongst certain groups calling themselves either metamodernist or explicitly employing that term in a meaningful way. I just, I couldn't help but get your get your perspective on it all.
I mean, it's more, the moment that people like Linda Huxton or Hassan or Jameson, when they write about postmodernism, of course, that also influences political discussions, right? That, it goes into common language and common vernacular. And so on the basis of those observations, because they were also observations, right? Whether it was literature or photography or sort of a more general cultural sentiment, those observations then filtered into political discourse. And so it's inevitable that the observations that make up much of the metamodern theories that I would suggest have been taking place, that they also filter into political discourse. I just think I have the academic distance, but it's also, right, it might be something that I feel affinity with, but I could also imagine that the vernacular that Robin and Alison and I have been creating alongside people like yourself, that could fall into hands of people that I disagree with entirely, right? So it would also just seem for me in a way weird to then cherry pick which of the political metamodernisms I find interesting, because as I said, metamodernism was just the label for a set of developments. We were trying to give words so that we could begin talking about this shit together, right? That indeed, that you can create a sense of a community to articulate stuff that we were feeling and perhaps didn't have the vocabulary to. And if that vocabulary is then used for all kinds of political purposes, then that is fine. But in a way, it's not my, isn't my interest. And it is something that, that potentially also worries me.
Yeah. So going forward from your own stance and your own, kind of focus on metamodernism, culturally speaking, and its emergence and evidence in the arts, what in the context of talking about the development of metamodernism, where do you see it? Well, I don't want to say where do you see it going necessarily, but where is your work taking you? I mean, are you still writing about metamodernism explicitly? Are you planning any more books or articles on the topic, or is it something that even the term, are you seeking any distance from, or is it something, what is the relationship of your work now to metamodernism going forward?
No, I'm not seeking distance from the term. I'm still very happy that we also use this terminology, and I still believe that this notion of metaxis is a very useful one to understand this movement, right? I think, I don't know if you and I spoke about it, but we toyed with a number. Doppeltakt is what Peter Sloterdijk calls this thing. There's metastability. There's all kinds of terms that try to describe this weird sort of oscillation, but for us, metaxia was the useful one. So I think I'm still quite pleased with metamodernism. I think it's also important to keep this notion of the modern and modernism in this label, right? There are people that say we shouldn't, and I agree politically. I think it'd be quite wonderful if we could set our sights on new models of coexisting and new models of meaning making that aren't beholden to the terrible histories that we associate with modernism and modernity, which include all kinds of colonialism and all kinds of totalitarianism and exploitation and systemic injustices and so on and so forth. But I do think, we're not living in a vacuum. As you said, history, it doesn't disappear, right? There's this layering and this sort of weird mixture of histories. And I think the spirit of the modern is still very much present there. So no, I don't stand apart from that. Well, at the moment, I'm working on 2 books that aren't directly tied to metamodernism, but yes, I'm still interested in it. I mean, we are working on a new book. I mean, we have been for years. So working is I think it's a big word, but yes.
It's in the works.
Yes. Alison and Robin and I we've been talking about it in any case. And I'm working on Depthiness a lot, which is an offshoot, I guess, of metamodernism. It's a particular principle of this metamodern structure thing that I have found very interesting from the beginning. And I think we share this probably, but this opening up of the metaphysical without actually ever actualizing it. For me, this is very interesting. Or this opening up of this recreation of the sensation of depth, of the possibility of depth, of the depth model, without ever actually articulating it, right? Because if we think about postmodernism and whatever it is that comes afterwards, eco-criticism, affect theory, that is all about surfaces and surface signification, I think for very important reasons, right? And we think about Deleuze and default, and we think about the plane of immanence. And so it's all on that same sort of level. And I I think personally believe that this is probably the right way to go about it. And yet, if we look at the cultural phenomena, they don't seem to follow this sense of the surface. They are all looking again for behinds and beyonds, for secret conspiracies, for deep states, for right. And so I am very interested in those reconsiderations of depth that aren't actualized and that often aren't. They don't exist, right? Often provably false, such as in the case of all of Donald Trump's allegations. So I think for me, this is, especially now with the pandemic and the anti-vaxxers and stuff, this is quite interesting. So I'm interested in depthiness. So this is after those two books that hopefully I write this year, that aren't entirely tied to metamodernism, then that's my next project.
That's actually a great segue, because I also really wanted to talk to you about, religion, spirituality, metaphysics, as you've kind of just touched upon, because human spirituality, it shows up in pre-modern culture, in modern culture, in postmodern culture, and I would say in metamodern cultural production. And I don't think I've ever read any. Well, correct me if I'm wrong. I don't think I've read anything that you've written where you maybe explicitly touch on metamodern spirituality per se, but exactly what you're talking about in terms of this depthiness idea and the metaphysical kind of move that's occurring there, I find as being distinctly a kind of metamodern move. And I've talked a lot about that. My whole after postmodernism thing on YouTube and whatnot is really kind of an exploration of that. But I'd love to get your thoughts on metamodern spirituality, however you might see that manifesting, or metamodern religion, however you kind of think about those ideas. Are there phenomena that you see as kind of characteristically or distinctly embodying that structure of feeling in their spiritual expressions?
No. And also, I think in a way, I'm not the right person to talk to. I think you yourself probably would be, you would be better, or Linda's work, of course, would be very useful here. So I'm in a way, it's not my expertise. I'm not the right person to talk to it, but sort of generally speaking, I think it's fair to say that in this new, if you are in this wasteland where you feel that, there's all this leftover stuff and you're trying to make meaning again, I think it's very important, or it's very obvious that different kinds of spirituality re-emerge, right? People are looking for meaning and they don't really know how to place it. A lot of the conventional frames of meaning making have been abandoned or have been proven to be either untrustworthy or unfair. And so people are looking. People are looking everywhere to make meaning, to find meaning in their lives, and this could be by believing in all kinds of political charlatans who will tell you that your lives will be better but it could also indeed be in religion. It could be in crafts, right? I think many people, and I'm guessing you yourself as well, are finding some meaning in crafts, in tiny gestures that give you meaning, or they will find meaning in various ecological movements. But so people are looking for new models to make meaning. And by meaning making, I don't just mean meaning for the self, but also meaning for the world and for your and your kids' place in that world. So I would imagine that spirituality is a part of that. I do find it interesting that particular types of spirituality seem to be popular, or more popular than they were. I am not so familiar with it, but this whole idea of manifesting and the secret, and that if you wish for something hard enough, is definitely happening. Those seem to me to be quite interesting models of spirituality that are popping up that I personally think are ridiculous, but everyone has a right to believe what they want. But they also seem to be entirely in line, of course, with neoliberalism and particular ideas around that.
Yep.
But so I think it's definitely a sign of the metamodern that we are returning to all kinds of spiritual modes. And I understand it, and I can also imagine that it creates useful bonds and communities. But it is interesting, I think, to focus on what types of spirituality we are seeing. But again, I'm guessing you and Linda, amongst others, are working on that.
Yeah, in fact, actually, we're going to be doing a panel at the American Academy of Religion in November on metamodern religion.
Oh, I'd be very. Is that going to be online?
It will, yeah. I think you can still sign up for that. I think I'm allowed to say that. I don't think there's any secret to it. But if there is,
very exciting.
yeah, it is.
I'd be very
cool.
thrilled to see. I mean, what do you think? I mean, let me return this question because I am certain you know more about this.
Well, I mean, gosh, what do I think? This is what I'm kind of, passionately, exploring and talking about and writing about, thinking about. So, I think you're right. I mean, by saying that, I just mean I could go on and on and on. But in brief, I think, yes, I think you're exactly right. I think that there's an urgency for meaning. There's a desire for depth. And I think you're exactly right that people are looking for that in all sorts of places, including ideological solutions, which are often wind up being broken. I mean, it's a common notion that ideologies are in some ways just broken religions, or at least in some ways incomplete kind of religious frameworks. And so I feel like in lieu of certain metaphysical ideas, which have been sort of seemingly discredited by the advent of all the ideas in modernity and post-modernity, that those options aren't really live options in the same way that they used to be for a lot of people anyway. And so there's an urgent looking around for alternatives. And yet what I'm most interested in is how the ideas kind of that you discussed about metamodernism, whether it's ironic sincerity or this pragmatic idealism or this, this sense of trying, maybe even in the awareness of inevitable failure, whatever that sensibility is, but that when you apply that sensibility to a meaning-making project, I think that you get some pretty interesting things. And I think that the neo-romantic turn is also there. There's a sense of a longing for that uniting of the transcendent and the immanent in some kind of paradoxical relationship. And I think you're also right that you're seeing that manifest in a way that's sort of a new kind of transcendence that isn't a this world, other world kind of dualism, but it's more of a monistic, there's this world and whatever the transcendent is, it's somehow in this world or within or something like that. So that's just a kind of 2-cent answer for some of that. But those avenues are the things I'm really passionate about exploring, not just descriptively, but also kind of prescriptively and enacting in some ways with my own writing. Yeah, but again, I could talk about that at some length.
That is interesting, right? It's not it's exactly. I mean, it's not a beyondness, but it's a seeing almost sort of through this world.
Yeah.
I don't know, Providence, or I mean, it's also in a way, I guess, an old project, but that seems to be quite.
It is an old project in some ways, and I also see, for me, yes, while you do see the resurgence of ideas like manifestation and whatnot, I think more compelling to me are the ways that mysticisms, ancient mystical ideas, are particularly kind of germane to this sort of a project, because it's usually in that mystical endeavor where the transcendent is seen as sort of an element of the immanent, or where form and formlessness come together, and yet also those mystical things, and I think this is key, and this is something Linda's work touches on a lot, is it's highly experiential. Gone are sort of the idea days when you could kind of listen to a religious authority and just, oh, that's what the truth is. Now it's much more, I need to experience whatever the truth is, and it needs to be, which I'm sure relates a lot to all of the epistemic, anxieties that now exist, that probably in many ways relate to everything that you're talking about in terms of just, what do we believe and how do we believe it? And, so yeah, I think that there's so many fascinating ways that our society is sort of grappling with these questions of what is truth? How do I believe anything? And what's the proper kind of mode of engagement with belief and with ideas and with truth in general? And all that's playing out in really messy and sometimes really fascinating and cool ways. That'd be my take.
No, but mysticism, I think that's also, I'm also quite interested in that in contemporary art, because that seems to be an interesting way to, to create these reverberations, or to sort of open up the sense of possibility, right? If we have the world, this whole end of history thinking and all those modeling and algorithms, of course, they set the world on a particular course, or let's say X amount of courses, right? These are all the possible routes. And I think what's quite interesting to me about some of those new movements, whether they are spiritual or artistic, is this idea of, okay, let's try to recalibrate. So let's not actually see what is a possible route out, but what is an impossible route, just to expand the horizon of possibilities that might also indeed lead to alternative political models, perhaps. So in that way, I'm also quite interested in it. But as said, I know very little about this. And it ties in perhaps with what you asked me earlier, with the variety of more pragmatic uses of metamodernism today. I take it for something that is interesting. I'm honored that people are using the work at all. I think on average, humanities papers are read by like 2 people. So I'm incredibly honored that people are engaging with the work at all. But I think it's also good that that's maybe left for other people that are better equipped to deal with those things than I am.
I'm curious though. I mean, could you ever see yourself using your own, model of metamodernism to interpret some of these, uses of metamodernism, if it makes sense? I mean, one of the things that really strikes me about at least the Hanzi work, but in others too, is sometimes there's a very explicit sense of here are the ideas that, Vermeulen and Robin van den Akker put forward about metamodernism. Let's use them to enact the way of sort of putting them into practice. So I think the whole kind of Hanzi persona comes out of I'm being ironically sincere in talking about these things. And I'm also going to give you a kind of a grand political program and meta narrative here, while also retaining this sort of ironic distance from it. So it seems like an enactment of the ideas that are aesthetic, but also for this end. So it doesn't seem, I mean, yes, maybe engaging with them at the level of, do you think that they're right or wrong, is maybe not the right approach, but it definitely, these things as cultural productions seem open to the realm of exploration using a metamodern lens.
I would agree there. I think that what I know of them is that they are themselves metamodern in promoting a particular metamodern politics. Yes.
Yeah.
But again, I hope you understand my caution.
Oh, very much so.
It's not necessarily a dismissal or something of anything that happened. As said, I'm very honored that people are using my work at all, but it's not a field of expertise that I have, and it's not a cop-out, but I think there's enough people these days that are talking about things that they actually haven't studied and making claims about things that they know very little about. And so I also think there's something to be said for trying to understand stuff that you actually, you've been studying for a while, right? That's your field. And so I'm honored, but it's not my field of expertise. And if I would engage with it at all, it would indeed be in that way. Is it perhaps itself metamodern? Maybe it's also, to be honest, maybe it's also just, it's awkward when you read stuff that you've written.
Sure.
It becomes a bit narcissist, I think, if you would. I don't know. It feels narcissist to engage with it then again myself, right? I don't know. It doesn't seem like a healthy thing.
Though it is intriguing too, because when I think about some of the postmodern theorists, there seems to be, as sort of part of postmodern theorizing and critique, a sort of inherently, let's just say that academic distance wasn't always maintained, and maybe that's, again, not a good thing. But, and also to your point, there are people, and maybe this, or maybe you're saddened to hear it, but there are people who use metamodernism as a term that are on the far right, that are trying to use it to, they don't really seem to have much sort of influence or sway, but there's still communities out there that are, so there's one of those things about when you
and
put
it's heartbreaking. I didn't know that. It's tremendously heartbreaking to hear.
Sure.
That.
So that's, it's like, I think in some ways, actually, this does kind of come out of postmodern thinking, that like, the author, as soon as they kind of put something out into the world, is sort of, then it's not really theirs anymore, and people can use it as they will. And so I think, it becomes difficult to probably navigate in what way you continue to engage with your kind of your thought children, kind of once they exist in the world. And so it's an interesting reality of engaging society at the level of trying to, I mean, I guess what I just always find interesting is the way that these paradigms become themselves part of cultural production. I mean, I think you could even look at sort of once postmodernism was a term and people could kind of say study it in art school, right? Then you get artists who are like, oh, okay, this is how you do this. Let me use my artist statement and say all the right things. And probably at that point, you could argue that there's a certain kind of decadence that would set in as soon as something becomes kind of so highly self-reflexive that it's sort of an enactment rather than just a spontaneous expression. And yet it still is a reality that once these things are out there, they become part of the cultural conversation for people to use. And then I guess that's the open question, is like, are they then amenable to the same paradigm of analysis that generated them, or is there something kind of meta, ironically, about what's occurring in that situation that, you know, is almost kind of demands the almost a development of a new paradigm to think about? I don't know. I hesitate to say anything like metamodernism, because, you know, these things could become really ridiculous, but there it is. Anyway, any kind of closing thoughts? I know you've got to go soon, on just sort of the future of metamodernism as a paradigm, as a cultural lens, as a structure of thought or a structure of feeling, or your own work.
No, other than that, I think it's obvious that those fault lines that Rowson and I described in the 2010 article, and that all of the contributors, both on the blog and then in the 2017 book, described, they seem to be hardening. So if we're thinking of metamodernism as this sensibility characterized by this oscillation, this both neither, this metoxis, then I think that begins to be an increasingly tough and hardened tension. And so I think the fear is that will snap, or the fear is not the right word. Well, I mean, I'm saying fear because, of course, I'm thinking of, in this case, of particular populist movements. And so I am afraid of that turn to fascism, or whatever we could call it. Mm-hmm. But no, I don't know. I think these are just very odd times. I read the other day that the Gulf Stream is disappearing, which is, especially if you come from Holland, this is not great, right? I live in Norway, not great. Yeah. So I think those things will change everything once again. I do think, however, that they will reinforce, they will deepen this sense of desperation of an island to choose. Mm-hmm. Right? What do we do? This sense of urgency, like, oh fuck, here we are, it's all falling apart. Where do we go? How do we move, knowing all that we do, having learned in school all that we have? How do you move from there? And so I think the fault lines are hardened, they are solidifying, you might say, which may also means they might break. And at the same time, they reinforce this sense, urgency, of desperation, of where do we go. And so that would be my 2 cents.
Yeah, one of the things that I know is sort of a meaningful way in to the conversation of metamodernism for people that I'm familiar with, I think of Jeremy Johnson, Zach Stein, talk about the time between worlds, the idea of the meta as being this between. And as you said, I mean, it's sort of a placeholder, you know, it's like, here's what we're seeing, and here's a term to talk about these things, but it's not necessarily a program. It's not a solution. It's just a description. And, you know, that meta in some ways seems to encapsulate this idea that, like, we're between worlds. There's a modernity or version of it that we're kind of exiting precipitously and maybe falling off the cliff from. And we're going to land somewhere, presumably, but no one really knows where that is and what that looks like. And so, yeah, part of that placeholder idea is talking about metamodernism, not just from what we're seeing, but sort of slightly trying to extrapolate, well, where might we be going? But for now, we're between answers. But anyway, I think your work, well, I know this to be true, has been super helpful for many people to think about the world and to try to get a sense of, you know, just having some terms, some phrases, some frameworks of being able to interpret the things that you're seeing I know that obviously it serves an academic function of analysis, but it also, I think, in terms of the meaning making desire too that we were speaking of a few minutes ago, it's very helpful. And I think that to the degree that it does retain its connection to an academic kind of rigor and empirical reality, like, yes, this does accurately describe the world that we're living in. I think it also has a kind of psychological just bolster of like, all right, well, there's some clarity there. So I think that I know I speak for, I'm sure many people who just find that very much in your work and find it helpful. And wherever we may be going and however much uncertainty there may be, it's at least edifying and fruitful to be able to situate ourselves a little bit better in this crazy world that we're in. And I think that your work really helps do that in a meaningful way. So thank you for that.
That's very humbling. And I am grateful, as I said, that people have read it at all. Yeah. It's not a given. So I'm really grateful that people have read it at all. And also it's nice to know what ship we're on before we hit the iceberg. At least we can say, well, this was us.
Yeah. Or hopefully maybe there's something of a Tolkien-esque catastrophe that'll occur, that all of a sudden the eagles will show up and, hey, that was good. But anyway, Tim Vermeulen, thank you so much for this conversation. I really appreciate it. I've been wanting to talk to you for a long time, and maybe we can do it again at some point. I'm super excited to see that book in the works. And any other stuff that you're putting out. So is there anything you would want to direct anyone to who's watching this in terms of a website or stuff that you're putting out right now or anything?
No, I mean, I'm, as I said, I'm doing 2 books now, and then next year, hopefully the Depthiness book will be written, but and eventually the Metamodernism monograph. But let's see. No, but thanks again so much for having me and for doing this and for having your wonderful series and those splendid explanatory videos on YouTube, which thanks. I think are spot on. So that's really great work. Cool. And it's lovely to see you again, man.
Yeah, likewise, for sure. All right, my friend. Well, take care. I really appreciate it. And Godspeed.
Yeah. Take care.